All right, so today we are doing the second part of the Populism and Segregated South lecture, where we're looking at continuous segregation. So we looked at the restrictions that attempted to limit, actually not just limit, but outright deny black voting through the various methods that were created to ensure that through the poll tax, literacy test, and that wouldn't take place. And then initially trying to have a grandfather clause to allow white voters to still be able to vote, because ultimately they ended up getting excluded as well when that was deemed not acceptable and it had to be stopped. Then of course the literacy tests were separate, even though they pretended that it was kind of random who got what. It very clearly was given much more difficult prompts or specific aspects from the state constitution for black applicants than it did for white applicants. So now we're looking at the shift to formal segregation, right? So there was no single policy initially that took place prior to Plessy v. Ferguson, okay? So there were already policies in place from individual states and buildings and things like that. Individual companies had their own rules, but there wasn't like a specific rule or regulation and stuff like that. Things that were already common and taking place, requiring black people to sit in the back of, whether that was a bus, a theater, whatever building, that they didn't have separate facilities, then that you had to sit in the back. They started making black people go in the rear entrance of stores and other buildings rather than enter through the front. If they had separate facilities, there were some that created them and stuff. But this was some of the kind of aspects that were already in place prior to Plessy v. Ferguson. But again, there wasn't like a unified official structure prior to that. The other thing that did take place, and actually becomes more prevalent after Plessy v. Ferguson, is also different locations. So while this did happen, it was more common with Plessy v. Ferguson. Different locations meaning that there would be a separate facility for black people for, let's say, a motel, so the motel would basically offer like this was for white people, and then there was a separate but same company motel for black people, but that would be further away, or the bathrooms for black people would be further away. And this is going to be an increasing issue that emerges during segregation, the formal segregation, is that these supposed separate but equal facilities were not only not equal, but were completely inconvenient, so that the availability of bathrooms, of water fountains, of motels, of daily things that people needed to use in public spaces were extremely far away from where basically the white facilities were located. So, in the case in the picture here, right, it's just right next to it. But oftentimes it wouldn't be separate like this. It would be in a completely different location. So if you were thirsty, you had to go find the drinking fountain that you were allowed to use, and it would be inconvenient. It was meant to be far away, and this was intentional to make things as inconvenient and difficult as possible. Now, what happens is that with Plessy v. Ferguson, Homer Plessy ends up suing the railroad company. The Louisiana Railroad ends up being sued for their segregation policies, which leads to sues railroad. And that leads to eventually the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which the Supreme Court's decision says that states had a right to create separate but equal facilities for black and white people. Of course, again, this line here, this part of the quote for this was, the reality is that there were no equal facilities. But what it does do is it creates a systematic structure for segregation for the South. You officially enter into official systematic structure of segregation with this court decision, and it creates a whole structure of society centered around this idea of segregation. So it was there before, but Plessy v. Ferguson made it legitimate and gave the states and counties and individual businesses the right to openly segregate with the backing of the court, with, of course, where it said separate but equal, but no one followed the equal part of that. If the one of the policies that still went into place is if you didn't have separate facilities, then that you would go back to where people would be forced to sit in the back or the rear and go in the rear entrance, things like that. So in theaters, if there was like a balcony level, Black people would have to go in the back entrance and go up to the balcony level. They weren't allowed to sit in the lower level of the theater, right? Because there weren't two separate movie theaters for people. And transportation also had that too, with railroads and buses and things like that, where they didn't have separate buses. So again, it was you had to sit in the back, and white people got to sit in the front. So you see, transportation tended to be the just different locations, theaters, some of the larger shops and things like that tended to not have. Of course, they weren't going to build two department stores from the same company. So instead you had different locations for people to enter, to have access to, things like that. And just like with the theaters. But it created a whole system of also creating separate facilities for Black people, which again never followed the equal structure in any way. And came to, and I think this is important with this, it came to represent or be part of every aspect of life in the South. And you could not avoid this. You could not be aware of it. It permeated every component of society. So this started including drinking fountains, restaurants, parks, swimming pools, bathrooms, the bus, school and libraries, every single public system. Right, and of course, where this was significantly having an impact was that there was a significant difference between white schools and Black schools. The funding was not even close to equal. So Black schools ended up being, even though that there were closer white schools to where people lived, if you were Black, you could not attend the school that was only a mile down the road. You had to go 8 miles away to the school. And of course, there weren't any buses or transportation provided for Black students. So they had to walk a long ways or get dropped off if the family had the means to schools that were underfunded intentionally, had books that were extremely old. The buildings were not in good upkeep, all under the guise of separate but equal, when clearly just comparing the two schools and the facilities would have shown very obviously that none of this was equal in its system. And of course, this was meant to systematically reinforce white superiority over the Black population on a daily, continual basis. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's so pervasive with segregation, is that everything around you was thrown into your face that you were not equal. And intentionally so, a perpetual and constant reminder that you were deemed lesser than because you were Black rather than white. And that was very intentional on the South's part to do so. With this, of course, with all of these different facilities and things like that, of course, like I said, the poor condition and quality was a huge part of it. Here we can kind of put the list here. So poor condition and quality. I mean, you can see even with just the difference in, and this is a minor example, right, between the drinking fountains, but you can even see the difference just in the drinking fountains in terms of quality. And this is a small thing. There were some that were far more extreme within that. The fact that, as we mentioned, it was further away, so the inconvenience of being and the difficulty of being able to find a bathroom, right? If you were traveling in the South, you had to be able to know like the locations of where you could, if you were a Black person, where you could go. Where were the bathrooms? Where were the places you could stay? Because there you could get yourself into a situation that was not only dangerous, by being in a location that was kind of for white people, but also have difficulty finding places to eat, finding places to go to the bathroom, finding places to get water, because they were not, they intentionally made them less accessible, and then generally provided less options as well. So while there might be, a whole bunch of locations to find a bath for rest stops and stuff, there would be 1 to every 3 rest stops for white people. Therefore, again, having the necessity to know this ahead of time if you were going to travel at all, because it was so difficult to manage, and this was done intentionally. And then, of course, the taxes and funding were not applied equally. So any of the Black institutions and facilities did not get the same amount of money from taxes and funding from state funding. Again, so that they didn't have any money to be able to improve the conditions of the facilities or the area. And this was done intentionally, just like we're going to see with the Jim Crow caricatures. It was done on a daily, repetitive level, to intentionally to reinforce white power and superiority and reestablish control over the Black population. And there were very strict laws to enforce segregation. So with, let's see, we're running out of space here. We'll put laws in there and then put them down here. So, of course, there were fines. There was always the threat of jail time. You could be fined, you could be jailed for that. And then, of course, there was physical violence. There was always the threat of assault. This goes with the institutional threat of violence with the Klan. But it didn't, here's the thing, right? With the Klan, I put the KKK, but really we could just put everyday people. Because there was the Klan, but this is what's crazy about segregation. We talked about the Klan before in Reconstruction, and people started wearing the hoods because they were trying to hide their identity, because they didn't want to get arrested or in trouble. And you had then the Enforcement Act, the Klan Act, to be able to arrest people like that. But in the segregation, people didn't need to be part of the Klan anymore and didn't need to wear hoods and cover their identity. The open violence was allowed. It was overlooked. I mean, even if technically it wasn't legally in the books allowed, it was allowed in all aspects of this. And we'll see this when we talk about lynching. It's the most violent and obvious example of that. But and it's extreme. It's brutal. And it happened way too often on way too regular basis. But there was even more regular type of violence that took place, just in verbal threats and physical assault in the public streets, right? That didn't lead to lynching, but that kind of held the air of threat over it. And people didn't hide themselves. Law enforcement often either could not stop or did not care to stop, which was often the case, this type of violence. So people, if you drank from the wrong water fountain and were seen, you would be verbally assaulted for sure, and most likely someone would come up and punch you, kick you, physically attack you for having the audacity to challenge the system. And so not only did you face fines and jail for doing so, but you faced the physical violence and the fact that people didn't even have to dress up and be in the Klan to hide their identity anymore, but could do this publicly. Again, if we go back to lynching, there people would go and no one disguised themselves. They took pictures of it, made it into postcards, and blatantly, you know, their face was seen by everyone. No one cared. There wasn't any repercussions for this type of violence that took place. So you didn't even need the Klan. So it's actually why the Klan's membership actually deteriorates for a while and then has a massive boom in the 1920s, because in the 1920s they have to go back to pretending to hide, well, not pretending, but to hide their identity more. So the Klan's popularity increases again because people didn't want to stop those acts of violence against black people. They just now would be jailed and charged, or more likely to be, and so then they started hiding their faces again. But during the segregated South period, for this period here, before up until like the 1920s, this you start, and actually even after that in the South, so still in the segregated South, I think the Klan membership movement, it was more in the North that increased that, where they were having to hide their faces, because the reality is in the South you didn't have to. Rarely was anyone held accountable for any type of violence if they were white against a black person. And then, of course, there was always, for women, the threat of sexual assault and rape. So you had all of these consequences, if you will, that were both like the legal ones, fines and jails, right? This side was the law, officially, and then these ones here were society. But the laws didn't stop these illegal things from taking place. The sheriff, the policeman, the government officials all tacitly approved of this type of violence to reinforce the idea that this was acceptable to do in the South, right? They were trying to mimic early behaviors of slavery in the South, reinforce white superiority, as was mentioned, and so all of this was curated to do that on a daily basis, so that there was no way to forget or pretend that it did not exist. And then you had in white society this violence being normalized and approved by the society, by the government, by officials, by everyone. Which just allowed for and bred more violence on top of that. So this was a situation and structure of segregation at this time, and how it came to dominate the South. This also led to Jim Crow, which sometimes the separate but equal is called Jim Crow laws. But there was a separate component of Jim Crow, which wasn't just the laws of segregation, but the caricatures that emerged to represent Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow was originally a character in a minstrel show, and this was, we can put here, started as a show, and it was a white person in blackface. And the character's name, right, was Jim Crow. There was also a song around the same time that emerged. So that's where the name came from, was both this minstrel character and the song that was Jim Crow. And blackface is going to be, when we talk about like the history of blackface and why it's such a horrible thing, and why it's so problematic to this day, is because of its history and connection to the violence, the oppression, the mockery, the belittling and degrading of black people. It was not a harmless thing. It was done and curated intentionally to degrade and minimize black people as people. And so we're going to look at that. And one of the ways was, again, in these shows, and it later goes to television and some movies, where blackface was used, and then plays, the minstrel shows where people go to, which were white people dressing up as black people, but portraying them in a very negative light intentionally to minimize them as human beings. And so you had these stereotypes and characters to reinforce racism. Was that, again, it was a form of mocking and belittling. In the Jim Crow character, it was this kind of comical stupidity, if you will, right? The idea was the character was low intelligence. That's what made it, that was what it was supposed to make it funny. He was kind of another word was often used was buffoon, right? And so the whole idea in these minstrel shows with these Jim Crow characters was meant for the audience to laugh at him, not with him, right? It was meant to mock this character. It was meant to belittle and degrade this character as someone of low intelligence who was a buffoon, who was, and there's different. We're going to look at there's several different character types, right? So there's the Jim Crow character that was usually like harmless but stupid, right? They weren't a threat, but they were just super low intelligence and generally buffoon in that aspect, and it was meant again to minimize Black people as people, to minimize any type of recognition of Black people as intelligent, as smart, as capable, so that it justified and reinforced white control. All of this was done for that purpose. Right, and so then this expanded into additional caricatures using and reinforcing stereotypes. Specifically, the whole idea was to essentially exaggerate physical stereotypes and exaggerate, intentionally over exaggerate. So whether that's with the basically anything with the face, the lips, mouth, even and body, right? And this physical, right? It was all about body stereotypes. So you'll see stuff specifically with, you can see it right here, an overemphasis on very large mouth and lips, various levels of how dark they made people appear, also tended to fit with certain types of caricatures on a regular basis. And then besides physical, there was an emphasis on behavior, how they acted, and work and labor and roles in society. All of these things were what was shown to reinforce what they wanted with that. So we'll look at that right with this. So one of the most common caricatures was the mammy caricature, which is, we'll go to this one here. This is Jim Crow, right? And so poor, somewhat again low intelligence, not very smart, meant to be laughed at, not laughed with. Mammy characters were women who were, let me go back here, larger women, always with domestic role, right? The roles in society and work and labor, their job was to be domestic, whether that was a housekeeper or a cook. They were meant to be like harmless and caring, right? The idea that they looked over and after people and stuff. Happy, most importantly, happy to serve white people. There were so many things that were meant to showcase this idea of the mammy caricature being content and getting fulfillment out of serving white people. And this was used in, so where you see it most, and you can see in this image, we go back to this one, these are salt and pepper. Some of these are sculptures, like, or little statuettes like this one, but some of these are salt and pepper shakers. That's very common. You can still find those like today in like antique stores. They're really common. They pop up everywhere because they were so prolific. The goal was to create these caricatures that we're going to be looking at and put them into everyday objects. right? That was the goal, because this would normalize the negative stereotypes. And if it's in all these products that you just use on a regular basis, if you see these caricatures constantly, day after day after day, it normalizes these views as acceptable. People don't question them as much. People just assume that they're accurate. They don't see them as these overt racist stereotyping caricatures that were created for a purpose. It was done to normalize. And so for the mammy caricature, it tended to be in where you saw in kitchen products and food products, because of course that was her role, right, in the kitchen, baking, serving. So again, salt and pepper shakers were really common, Aunt Jemima, food products, and there were tons of different things within these caricatures. You had figurines, things to decorate the house too, that were part of that. So this idea of that, right, she was supposed to be non-sexual, so she wasn't threatening, happy and pleasant. Essentially, there was essentially this creation of the good type and the bad type. And the idea was the good types were those who fit into the role of white society and what a good, quote unquote, black person would be. They would be following the rules. They would be respectful to white people. They would be serving white people. They would be content in their station. They didn't challenge the society or structure. They didn't get angry or upset, right? That was meant to curate in these characters, both good and bad characters. So for men, that ended up being kind of the old man caricature or the Jim Crow caricature. There's two of this. Jim Crow was technically separate than old man caricature, and there's a lot more. These are some of the most common ones, but there were even more caricature versions than this. But yeah, it definitely breaks down into good versus bad characters. And the good ones were those that white people saw as this is the appropriate way that black people should be. And then the bad characters were the ones that this is how black people should not be, based on white perception. And so that very much centered around that development of those. But again, trying to get it into every single thing. So it was pervasive in everything. I'll talk a little bit more of that after we get through these caricatures here. So the old man caricature, a little bit different than Jim Crow. Again, non-threatening, older, right? Thus old man. Often, oops. Go back here. Let's see if I can get that back. Oh, hang on, I'll pause while I fix this. Okay, I got it back. Non-threatening, older, right? Barefoot often. Again, a servant, often shown in a servant's role. So this was the somewhat goofy. So the Jim Crow sometimes overlapped with the old man caricature. Jim Crow was often a little bit younger and more of a buffoon and not intelligent. The old man caricature didn't always be shown as like not intelligent, but still someone who was poor, someone who was older and frailer. So while the mammy caricature was large and robust in all the depictions, the old man caricature was always shown as skinny, kind of weaker in stature, and meant to be this non-threatening individual that also was a servant and looked after and cared after white people. And then that sometimes mixed with the Jim Crow one of the not to be taken seriously, more about his lack of intelligence, and to be laughed at and made fun of as a joke, right? Almost subhuman, if you will, which was very much the intent. Then you have the brute caricature, which were black men as savages and rapists. Right? They were often portrayed as larger, physically strong. These were meant to be feared. Right? These are the ones that were meant to be seen as terrifying predators who targeted helpless victims, specifically white women. And these are the type of caricatures that will be used to justify lynching as well. In all cases, there was an over-sexualization of black children. This idea of, again, dangerous and bad. So you had, there was this card that showed a girl that looked about 10 years old and pregnant and was flirting in like whatever the quotation was for it. There was another one of a boy that was acting all frisky and sexualized. Again, they used children to sexualize them to show the dangers of black people. That black people, if they didn't fit into the good types of caricatures, then they were dangerous. Then they were overly sexual and to the point of absurdity. And it was meant to, again, put this negative light to have people look down upon them. There was also, of course, a lot of the Jim Crow caricature stuff. You could put another one here, was about violence. This included in games. They had games that had Jim Crow characters where you would throw like knives at them, and they were the target. Their face was the target. You had other ones with like a punching bag with their caricatures on it. There was one that talked about alligator bait, and it showed little babies, and that they were suggesting that they should be thrown to alligators as bait, right? So there was this, and again, this was meant to normalize violence as funny and acceptable and dehumanize people. I mean, the number of things that were showcasing violence. The images here with this picture are about the minstrel characters, and then you have these. The website, the Jim Crow Museum, showcases a lot of that stuff and showcases how the violence was used. Right, so these were the good kind of characters versus like I didn't put any of the bad characters, but the amount of violence in these kind of everyday objects, again, was intentionally done as well. So that there was this mix of mammy caricatures, old man caricatures, and then the negative caricatures, and then everyday objects that reinforced and normalized violence, even for kids. So the target with a face on it was meant for a child's birthday party. Right, so the goal was to have these products be used by families every day and have multiple things with these products in them to normalize these caricatures and this the way that they were viewed. And then have children be exposed to them at a very young age so that they also would grow up having this be super normalized, right? So by showing an over-sexualization, mostly naked young girls and boys and that were being, flirty and sexual or pregnant or the brute, right? That this idea of seduction with it, so they're dangerous, right? The bad characters, the whole emphasis was on that there was danger attached to it, versus the good characters that were meant to be the safe ones, but also again subhuman in all of that. So again, salt shakers, postcards, games, signs and advertisements, figurines, pictures, cooking utensils, kitchen stuff, obviously plays and things like that with the minstrel shows. You can even see here, there's this makeup, right, that specifically is for the blackface makeup for these shows that they had. Any kind of everyday object that you could think of was created to reinforce this. And I think the lynching postcards are the most horrific and also one of the best examples of how that violence was normalized to the point that you torture and kill a human being, and then you take a picture of it and put it on a postcard to send to a friend, right? That level of barbarity and indecency became so normalized in segregated South that people didn't even like go, oh, what? Why am I being sent this? Or, oh, this is a little much. No, none of that. Not, I mean, that's even a mild reaction, right? It should be outrage. It should be outrage and horror that this stuff is happening and being created. And instead, they had so normalized this through these Jim Crow caricatures and creating it on thousands and thousands of everyday objects that no one even like, and I guess not no one, but the majority of people did not think it odd to take one of those lynching postcards and send it to a friend, and have it not be completely unacceptable, right? And so that shows how well this structured, organized attempt to normalize this type of view of Black people and the violence against them as nothing out of the ordinary was super successful. And then, from the other perspective, as this horrific constant state of worrying about being in fear of this violence being enacted upon you if you stepped out of line. And the whole point was the idea that this is what happens to people who step out of line. This is what people who challenge this system. This was the South's attempt to create as close as possible a system of slavery within the new laws and regulations they had to follow. And so it was done in this incredibly violent and kind of horrific manner to normalize and reinforce white control with swift and pretty horrid consequences if anyone pushed back against it. And then again with the products and goods, by inundating it into every aspect of society, people saw these things in their homes. All over the place. They saw them out and about in towns when they went shopping. It was everywhere. And so it was meant to make people think this is normal, this is acceptable, because it is in so many things, in so many places, that it is, why would it be anything but normal, right? And that was the goal, and it was very successful in doing that and creating this system of terror to reinforce that. And that gets shown, I think, when we talk about Ida B. Wells here and lynching. So Ida B. Wells was an activist and a journalist, a really impressive woman who ends up largely focusing on lynching as her main form of activism. She also sued companies for discrimination and segregation. So she did other things as well, but she's best known for her crusade against lynching, because it was something she ended up taking up and focusing a lot on over the years. And because of her push against lynching, she ended up having kind of a bounty on her head in the South. She had to stay in the North after she started publishing and pushing back against lynching. This was common. Like Harriet Tubman was also had a huge bounty on her head before the Civil War, because of her work with the Underground Railroad. So, if you piss off people in the South, you get a bounty on your head, kind of thing. But she ended up having to move out and she could not go back into the South because of it was a guaranteed death sentence if she was found there, because of her activism and trying to bring to light what was really happening with lynching. Because that had also been propagandized by the states, by just white Southerners in general. And so she tried to bring that to light, what was really going on with that. So what is lynching? Lynching is, it's meant to create fear and terror, largely targeted at Black men. Although Black women were lynched, and occasionally, on a rare occasion, a white person was lynched as well for being an ally to Black rights or a Black person individually. So anyone who technically threatened the status quo and structure of the South was at risk of being attacked, beaten, and or lynched. But it was specifically, it was an informal system of justice, for, again, not justice. It was an informal system they claimed as of justice. It was an informal system of torture and cruelty that they put in the form of justice. That they tried to claim, right, that this needed to get done. It was violent. It was meant to terrorize. It was meant to do all those things. Lynching often was connected to hanging, but did not only stop with hanging. So we'll look at that, right? It had its roots in the Klan, the KKK. Although again, the KKK was not as involved around this period in times because he didn't have to be. So. Let me put here, right, we'll say roots with the KKK, but now you could be open and not hide the violence. Right, so the Klan had declined in some cases because it was no longer needed, because you could be openly racist and violent, and no one cared in the South about that. So there were earlier laws against this during Reconstruction, but those had all been moot and thrown out at this point with this system. So again, mostly it was hanging. It was meant to be. It was mob violence. There were unorganized lynchings, like that happened with mobs spur of the moment, and then there were organized lynchings. So the unorganized ones usually were connected to mobs kind of forming and then mob action taking place. These were not ones that were scheduled or that had a time and place. It arose up of whatever incident. People started growing in crowd, and then they would grab someone and then, commit the act of violence and torture and eventually lynch them. And then there were organized lynchings where they would set a date and time and tell people to come, and thousands of people would show up to watch this lynching take place. And so there are photos and postcards of large crowds that where people would bring their children and bring picnic baskets and treat it as an outing of entertainment to watch. Those were the organized lynchings that took place. Again, these were not done by officially by police or the governor or mayor. These were done by citizens. And I mean, but if you have a mob of 1,000, you aren't going to stop anything. And many times the police didn't care to either. So either way, but it's crazy that there's not only like unorganized as the kind of spur of the moment, spontaneous lynching, but that there were also organized ones where people put out ads in the newspaper for this day at this time, we're going to have a lynching for this person, come, everyone come. And people would travel to go watch these and treat it as a public event. It was not through the court system, right? Not through the court system. It was meant to bypass the court system. Even if they had police support, the whole idea was that it did not take place within the court system with that. These could be small groups or large groups, right? As I mentioned, if it was organized, that was put into the newspaper. Almost in all cases, pictures were taken, and most importantly, it was meant to be public, because of course when lynchings were meant to be a warning and to create fear and terror to get people to comply, right? To follow the rules and not push back against white control. So again, lynching was often hangings. That's what's most associated with lynching are someone being hanged, but they could be attacked, stabbed, burned, etc. Basically any horrible form of torture that you could think of and form of violence you could think of could take place before the actual hanging. I suppose the end result of almost every lynching was hanging, but there are some, that's not true though. There were some lynchings that are considered lynchings where people were shot. But even then, sometimes after people were shot or killed before they were hung, they would still end up hanging the person's body because they wanted that public display of violence. The whole purpose of lynching, besides being able to be extremely horrific and cruel and torturous towards someone, was to make this public display of this so that other people would be afraid to challenge this system. But again, any physical violence towards someone outside of the law that resulted in death was considered a lynching. So it didn't have to be a hanging. Any violence against someone outside of the law that resulted in death or attempted death was a lynching. It was extremely violent. Like I said, there were pictures taken and made into postcards so that people would send these postcards to family and friends as if it was totally normal and not horrific to have. And there was no, we didn't censor them. They were fully, you had pictures of mutilated bodies on these postcards with people standing around under a tree or under wherever the location that the lynching took place, smiling and pointing to the person who had been brutally murdered. It was, and again, that was to normalize things. It was meant to make it look like it was just, this wasn't, it was meant to normalize it for white people. It was meant to cause fear and terror in black people. There are so many horrific stories. They're really bad. Like, ultimately, like, it wasn't, rarely did someone just be shot or hung. They were beaten, they were stabbed, they had their privates cut off, people would cut off fingers, people would be burned before they would be hung. All manner of torture was inflicted on these people to the point that a lot of the people that were lynched, their bodies were mutilated. And then people would take body parts as souvenirs, and doling out pieces of a person. This was the violent nature of lynching. It's in that, and even there's a website called Without Sanctuary that showcases and goes through and talks about this and showcases the postcards. They started collecting the postcards, lynching postcards, to preserve and show for people to understand the violence and the horrific nature of lynching. It's extremely brutal to watch. So I did put the link in optional, but I did put it optional because it is extremely brutal and violent, and I think it's important to be aware of that going in. But no matter how much I describe it, it's never going to be enough for you to understand the sheer brutality and horrible nature that that lynching was, without seeing the images of what took place. You can describe it all you want. The idea that pictures are worth 1,000 words is true. It rings true in that sense of my descriptions are never going to do justice to the level of violence and brutality that lynching that took place in lynching. It's something I would recommend that's worth, as much as it's the brutality and kind of the grotesque nature of it, it's worth seeing to understand the level of violence that took place with this, because it's horrific. This led, so how did Ida B. Wells get into this? She ultimately, where I said, here, came to realize that lynching was just propaganda against black men, but the propaganda was the claim that they were violent and raped white women. And so let's look at the source with this. And what she realized is she discovered in one of her in her writings here that we're going to look at, that she's like, I realized this was not true, and began to campaign to bring to light what was actually going on with lynching. So this is about the story that took place when had her realize that this was not, in fact, true. This was with Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart owned and operated grocery store. There was already a grocery store owned by a white man, and he had a monopoly on that area. And now you had these black grocers come in and have competition. He was not particularly happy about that. He wanted his monopoly. And there was already pushback. It mentioned here that Thomas's grocery changed all that, and he and his associates were made to feel that they were not welcomed by the white grocer, which they were not. And so there was this day where boys, black and white boys both, were playing a game, and they started fighting over marbles. And it says that the black boys got the better of the fight, which followed. And so because children playing a game of marbles, it gave the justification for what followed next, which was that white people were going to come back on Saturday to completely pillage and steal all of Thomas's grocery store goods. It was all, a lot of this was supposedly instigated by this white grocer. Basically, he didn't like the competition, and so he used the justification of kids arguing over marbles to say, oh, white people need to go now raid the black grocer store and take all their goods, for however they connected that as a reasoning. So hearing this, right, it says, accordingly, the grocery company armed several men and stationed them in the rear of the store on that fatal Saturday night, not to attack, but to repel a threatened attack. So they defended the store to try to prevent thieves from coming in and stealing all their goods after they heard that this was going to go down. It did. And several white men ended up being shot on as they entered and tried to steal stuff from the store. This then led to running away and saying, we've been shot by black people. And over 100 black men were dragged from their homes and put in jail on suspicion of shooting white people, even though the white people were the ones that were breaking and entering and robbing the store. And then they had white people go through all these men that were in the jail and pick out the ones that were responsible for this. And of course, they picked out Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, the three officials of the grocery store. And they were loaded on a switch engine of the railroad, which ran back of the jail, carried a mile north of the city limits, and horribly shot to death. Right? And then one of the morning papers held back its edition in order to supply its readers with the details of the lynching. Then the mob took possession of the grocery store, helping themselves, the white mob, to food and drink, destroyed what they could not eat or steal. The creditors had place closed, and few days later what remained of the stock was sold at auction. Thus, with the aid of the city and county authorities and daily papers, the white grocer had indeed put an end to his rival's grocery store and business, or person actually too, and that's what she's saying. So he put an end to his rival as his person, he was killed, as well as to the business, right? So this why she gives this story is because it's the one that helped her realize that lynching was not just taking place against occasionally against super violent predators, but that it was happening to people who had done nothing wrong, right? She says, like many another person who have read of lynchings in the South, I had accepted the idea meant to be conveyed, that although lynching was irregular and contrary to law and order, unreasoning anger over the terrible crime of rape led to lynching, that perhaps the brute deserved death anyhow, and the mob was justified in taking his life. So this was the propaganda that was given for lynching to everyone. And she said that after the event with the black grocer, she realized that this was not the case. They had committed no crime against white women. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was. Right? An excuse to get rid of black people who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized. So this is the reason why she then realized that this is the true purpose of lynching, and then says, I began to search for more records and find more about it in order to tell what was actually taking place. Most cases were like that of lynching, which happened in Mississippi. And so she gives an example. The big burly brute was lynched because he had raped the 7-year-old daughter of the sheriff. I visited the place afterward and saw the girl, who was a grown woman more than 17 years old, right? So there was no kid, there was no rape, they just had had a relationship. And she'd been caught. And in order to save his daughter's reputation, the sheriff led a mob against him. So she wrote that what got her in final trouble, and the end of the journal Free Speech shut down, is she wrote that, if you keep claiming that all these men are raping white women, people are going to start questioning that. And it was definitely, she was mocking them. If Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves, and a conclusion will be drawn which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. So she basically said, hey, if you guys keep claiming this over and over again, eventually people are going to think, white women sure seem to love to sleep around with black men, and then you're going to have a problem there. She was intentionally baiting them. They got pissed. After this event, the Free Journal gets shut down, and she can't go back to the South. So she's, from her work from this to bring to light what's going on, she, like I said, she ends up being targeted, threatened, and not even being able to go into the South because of this. Having lost my paper, had a price put on my life, and been made to exile from my home for hinting at the truth, I felt that I owed it to myself and to my race to tell the whole truth now that I was where I could do so freely. So she studied more and more. So she was claiming right here, she was just hinting at, she didn't full out forcibly say what was going on. She said, now that I've been kicked out, I have a bounty on my head, I've lost my job, I've been exiled, I'm just going to straight up tell what's going on now. Everyone needs to know exactly what's going on. The more I studied this situation, the more I was convinced that the Southerner had now never gotten over his resentment, that that black people were no longer his plaything, his servant, and his source of income. That federal laws for black protection passed during Reconstruction had been made a mockery by a white South where it had not secured their repeal. The same white South had secured political control of its several states, and as soon as white Southerners came into power, they began to make playthings of black people's lives and property. Here came lynch laws to stifle them. And it was for the purpose of striking terror into the hearts of black people who might be thinking of consorting with willing white women. But also, she mentions easier, also just gaining economic wealth, pushing back against unfair laws. Said that the entire race should be branded as moral monsters and despoilers of white womanhood and childhood, was bound to rob us of all friends we had and silence any protests that they might make for us. For all these reasons, it seemed a stern duty to give the facts I collected. So she's arguing like this whole propaganda was that it was all about, vile murder and rape of young white women and children, was to make it harder for people to defend against it, right? That was what she's saying right there, right? They set it up so that people would, if they tried to say, oh, this is horrible, people would be like, so you're supporting a rapist and murder, even though that's a false analogy there with that. But that was what this was set up to do. And she says, so it's important that I tell the truth and expose what's really going on, that this is not the case of what's taking place. And it's all about this. And so that people are aware and know, and we can start pushing back and trying to get lynching laws into effect. And she was very successful at not only bringing awareness to the cruelty and true nature of lynching, but also pushing for the creation of anti-lynching laws to help eventually bring the end of lynching being legal. It took a long time, but she was instrumental in some of those anti-lynching laws that ended up being developed and taking place. All right, and then lastly, I want to look at Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Booker T. So these were two major black activists that were well known in their time for pushing towards change. and increasing black rights. They had some overlapping views and then also some different views in the process too. So Booker T. Washington, they're both social activists. He was a leading black educator. His main argument was economic improvement in order to strive for social equality. He said if you get good education, that allows you to get a good job, which gets you good money, which will allow for social equality. So that was part of his main belief. He believed in this idea of, when they mention it here, gradual equality for black people. Not because he didn't think people should have equality right away, but he felt that if it was the steps of education, good money, good job, money, social equality, that gradual shift towards equality for black people would cause less fighting and violence to occur, that it would naturally shift to equality through these actions, right? So that was kind of the idea with this. W.B. Du Bois believed that Booker T. Washington's views were appeasement and just accepting of the status quo. He argued for ceaseless agitation for civil and equal rights. He believed that society would not willingly change, and it would have to be forced. He was also for education, but not for only economic gain, but that it would create future black leaders that could fight the system and change political systems. Right? He said he basically felt that it was wrong, as it mentioned, to expect black people to earn their equality, that it should be immediate equality for them because they already should have had the right, and that they were going to have to constantly fight and push for it because only through force, and not necessarily physical violence, but they were going to have to force white people into accepting equality. It wasn't going to just happen gradually, whereas Booker T. Washington had hoped that this would, this improvement, economic improvement would lead to natural equality where people would accept and come to see black people as equal as well. So they weren't the only ones. They are just two of the most well-known during this time. And very much pushing, against disenfranchisement, segregation. So they were for voting, ending segregation, but definitely W.B. Du Bois was way more forceful on that. But there were many black activists that emerged during this time. We just looked at Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, W. Du Bois, who came and started fighting and pushing back against segregation, against the inequality that existed, for increased black rights and political rights. So this was also a period, as much as there was against, trying to normalize white superiority and violence against black people, there was also many black leaders that came and emerged during this time to push against these systems that had rooted in the South. And so we'll leave it at that. I think the last thing with this is just that, of course, like segregation continued. This wasn't a short thing, right? From the end of Reconstruction until the 1960s, segregation was a component, a daily aspect and life in the South. So this was a long-standing thing that took place in the South, and it took a long time to end, up until the Civil Rights Movement. So I think sometimes when we talk about this in history and when we say, okay, and now we're talking about the progressive era, people think now segregation is over. It's not. Segregation is continuing. It's going to keep going. It doesn't end until the Civil Rights Movement. So you're looking at the 1960s, right? So a very long time in the South, segregation continued and was the prevailing order of that area. And it took the Civil Rights Movement to really force and make significant change with integration, with the end of segregation, with better protections. And even then, there were still many rights that women still being able to get the right to vote. White women will get everyone technically gets the right to vote in the 1920s, which we'll talk about, but practically black women still didn't have the right to vote in the South. There were still aspects of these things that, as rights were being won and changes were being made, black people were still largely left out of that system. So I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that this continues on. This isn't something that ends now. Now we're done with segregation. Nope, it continues through the 1960s. All right, see you next time.